We did not intentionally match with our plaid shirts today.
Absolutely not.
This is not planned. It feels good for what we're doing today. Doesn't it seem weirdly appropriate, you know?
Yes, there is some meat involved.
It's hearty. Something you'd eat on a cold day, maybe when you'd wear it. Yeah, I think it works.
Perfect.
Today we're talking about Ragù alla Bolognese, or what probably just a lot of people call it, just Bolognese sauce. This isn't gonna quite just be another how to make Ragù alla Bolognese video though, because it's a little bit of a complicated topic.
So, Ragù alla Bolognese, it's a meat-based sauce. But the difference between the other ragu, for example, the Sunday sauce, Sunday gravy, or Ragù alla Napoletana, is that the Bolognese has ground meat, while the Ragù alla Napoletana has big chunks of meat.
Well, yeah, in Southern style Ragù, you actually take the meat out. So there's no actual meat in the finished sauce, it just flavors the sauce, whereas this,
The meat is
in
part
the sauce,
of the sauce.
As the name suggests, it's from Bologna.
It's used to make the lasagna, it's used to make the tagliatelle alla bolognese, it's used to make cannelloni. It's a sauce that is really a must in the food of Bologna.
So over the years, Eva has made Ragù alla Bolognese on the channel a few times before. Maybe sometimes she's making a lasagna.
Or cannelloni.
Yeah, and the truth is that her recipe isn't really the traditional recipe. And because of that, because as you know, Italians are very attached to their traditions, she's taken a lot of heat for that over the years. So we thought it would be fun today to explore Ragù, show you the traditional, original recipe, whatever you want to call it, then show you Eva's modified, tweaked recipe, and also come back to explore why even if Eva's recipe isn't the traditional recipe, it's still the correct recipe. That'll make sense later, I promise.
One of the meat that this recipe uses is fresh pork belly. This is not bacon, this is not smoked, this is a slice, as you can see, of pork belly that we got to a normal butcher. We went there and we asked, can you give us some slice of pork belly?
And you do need to be careful because this is called pancetta in Italy, right?
This is called pancetta.
But
Pancetta
often
fresca.
if you go and get pancetta,
It's cured meat.
it's cured meat, which is not what you want.
No.
So you want just raw pork belly, right?
Sì. This recipe of Ragù alla Bolognese requires as a fat not just the olive oil, but also a little bit of butter. I'm using a medium low heat because I need the butter melts completely. When the butter is completely melted, we can go in with the pancetta. And what we need to do is saute the pancetta until the lard will melt. Next we have the soffritto. Now the soffritto in Italy is one of the condiment-based base that you need for your sauce. It will be made with carrots, celery and onion. And already the smell changed completely because right now is just an explosion of amazing smell. After a few minutes that we are sauteing the pancetta with our soffritto, and the soffritto is what we say in Italian appassito, which means is appassito. It's like a flower before it's fresh and then it's like
Wilted?
I don't know.
Doesn't sound appetizing, but when the onion's kind of soft and tender and all that, yeah.
See, this looks a little bit more appetizing than wilted. By the way, when you reach this stage, what you need to do is add the ground beef. One thing that makes the Bolognese Ragù unique is that the meat you find inside is grounded meat. And the original or recipe requires 4 ground beef. You need to break, obviously, the ground meat and try to brown it all the way around, all the way through. After all the water of the meat is completely evaporated, and you understand this because actually the sound of the meat, the sound of your ragu will change completely, is the moment in which we can add the wine. Now I'm going with half glass of red wine, but if you don't like red wine or if you don't have, you can use also white wine. We reduce the heat at minimum, lower, and we let the wine completely evaporate. In this case, the old recipe requires coals for tomato paste. It's obvious that our ragu using just the tomato paste needs a little bit of liquid to cook, because this needs to cook for about 2 hours, 2 hours and a half. And we are going to use broth, meat broth. In this case, I'm going to use beef broth that I made at home. Pay attention when you buy the store broth, because sometimes it can be a little bit too salty. So you need to pay attention on the quantity of salt that we are going to add in your ragu. We will bring this to a simmer and then we let it cook for about 2 hours, 2 hours and a half. You need always to keep an eye on your ragu, because if it dries out too much, you need to add a little bit more broth. While this ragu is cooking, I'm going to make my own Bolognese ragu.
Okay, so since your ragu recipe is obviously similar to the traditional recipe, I would say go ahead and cook, and I, representing the Bologna police, will cut in when necessary.
What's the problem?
Bologna police here. You don't use butter.
No, I don't use butter, I use just olive oil, because my ragu is healthier than the Bologna one.
Also, you just like olive oil more.
I like olive oil. I could have used some lard, but I'm not going to use the lard.
That doesn't look like all beef to me.
No, it's not all beef. It's half beef and half pork.
Nutmeg.
Yes, because nutmeg is good, Harper. Nutmeg is good.
Wee-hoo. Tomato puree.
Now, my Bolognese ragu needs to cook as the other one, which means for about 2 hours and a half, 3 hours. But there is still another big difference that we are going to show you very soon. The ragu is almost done, but we missed the last ingredient that you will never find in my Bolognese recipe, which is milk. And now we need to let it cook for about 20 minutes, no more.
Okay, we have both ragùs done here. Obviously, quite a different visual appearance. Now, this is definitely the first time I've ever had both ragù versions, yours and the traditional recipe, in front of them, so maybe I can do a quick taste test. Okay, starting with the OG, the traditional recipe here. Very, very good. It's excellent. If you just ate that, you would be very happy and very satisfied, and you would go away thinking that you've had the best bolognese of your life. Let me try EVA'S bolognese here. All right, we gotta talk about this. So, who is the winner here? Frankly, anyone who makes either of these is a winner because they're both really, really good. Obviously, Eva prefers her recipe, which is why she makes it that way. Why else would she make it that way? I definitely prefer Eva's recipe.
And this is not because we are married.
This is definitely not because we are married. I would totally call it how it was if I preferred this one. They are both super excellent, but in my opinion, particularly because the most major difference between them is the tomato base. I love the more tomatoey taste, but it's also minor things, like for instance, the milk. I tasted this one before and after you added the milk, and I do have to say that without that tomato base, I do think the milk made this a little bit better. It makes sense, but in general, liquid dairy like milk and cream with tomatoes, it just kind of dulls the tomato taste too much. So now Eva's Ragù recipe was born out of simply personal preference. You're a Southern Italian, you sure like your tomatoes.
We like more the tomatoes than the milk.
Milk and cream, not so much.
But tomatoes as much as you want.
So that's really how this recipe was born. But even though this is not the traditional recipe, it has sort of become the traditional recipe. So the really traditional recipe was always sort of what would you call it? Not categorized, maintained.
Was like
standardized by, what's the organization? The
Camera di Commercio di Bologna.
It's like the Chamber of Commerce, right?
Yes.
The Bologna Chamber of Commerce. And they are like the standard keepers of what the bolognese recipe is, the real bolognese recipe. And so basically this was their recipe for a very, very long time. However, Eva is not the only cook who was like, you know what tastes really good in this? Tomatoes. She was not the only one, and so after a very long period of the recipe kind of evolving and cooks in their own kitchens and cooking, adapting the recipe a little bit, they finally, just within the last year or two, couple years,
2023,
they actually updated the official recipe. And so all of the changes that Eva had been doing over the years to her bolognese recipe are now like canon. They're part of the law of Bologna.
So we can say that this bolognese recipe right now is the official recipe of the bolognese ragu.
For instance, now you can use a mix of beef and pork. They very clearly though say no veal. Don't you dare use veal. But beef and pork is fine.
Beef and pork. You can use nutmeg.
You can use nutmeg, tomato puree.
Tomato puree or whole peeled tomatoes.
The milk is now optional.
If you like, you can put. If you don't like, you can skip it.
I think the only rule that you break that hasn't been officially sanctioned is your use of only olive oil.
See, but that is
it's such a minor thing.
A personal preference.
If you want to make a real bolognese, use a little bit of butter.
But believe me, you don't really taste the difference.
I think that this phenomenon of sort of official recipes and standardization, I know for me it was very strange when I first started to experience Italian culture and the intense protection of traditional recipes. And I think that probably to a lot of people, this would seem like sort of something silly, and like how this would maybe, they would look at this as an example of close-mindedness and being against innovation and stuff. But the way that I actually have come to see it is actually that it's a very important and good thing. And the reason for that is to be anti-fad and anti-trend. Does that make sense?
To me, as an Italian,
well, yeah, of course
absolutely.
It makes sense to you. Of course it makes sense to you. I'll give you, here's an example. So carbonara, everyone knows, or should know, that carbonara doesn't have cream in it, right? However, the truth is that there was a trend in Italy for a brief period of time in the 80s when, because one very influential chef in Rome started putting cream in his carbonara, and it took off, and it was this trend and this fad, and for a long time everybody was putting cream in their carbonara. But the problem is that that turned out to just be a passing trend, a passing fad, and I think that there's great value in being very hesitant to change until you see that something is really generally accepted by a lot of people over many generations. This happened over like hundreds of years, you know? And so really waiting to see like, okay, it seems clear that the people of Italy have decided collectively that tomatoes can go in a Bolognese ragu. Can you imagine today if every time some like TikToker made some new Bolognese recipe and it was like, oh, that's the new this is the new recipe. No, it's better to stay the course, see how things go, wait another 100 years, see if it...
Be sure that this change, actually, you need to make this change. And then maybe, as it happens with the Bolognese, it will be officialized.
So never let it be said that Italians don't innovate. They do, just over, you know, a few hundred years.
We want to be sure. It's like we can't change our mind every other day. When we change, we know that it's for the better.
Yeah. Now, you're probably wondering, how are Harper and Eva gonna eat this Ragù alla Bolognese? Well, here's the thing. We're not doing anything with them today because next week we're coming back with something that you can do with Bolognese Ragù that most people don't really think of. Typically, everyone thinks of Bolognese Ragù and they think of like, you know, pasta, tagliatelle, or maybe if they're getting crazy, a lasagna, but no, there's more that you can do with it. So stay tuned for that video. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you see when it comes out. We will put a link to the like official Bolognese from Bologna recipe if you want to make this one, the old version, down in the description below. Also in that article, they'll mention some of the accepted changes that are new. If you want Eva's Bolognese recipe, I will put a link down below. We do have it on the website. However, if you want a more updated and more polished version, you will find it in the Italian Family Kitchen, our cookbook. Speaking of our cookbook, we got a nice email from Deborah. I made your polpettone tonight for guests. It was amazing. Love your new cookbook. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for trying the recipe. Polpettone is like Italian meatloaf.
Polpettone, Harper.
It literally means really big meatball. Super good recipe. Well done, Deborah. All right, guys, we'll see you next week when we're gonna do some fun stuff with this Bolognese Ragù.
Ciao.